Hello and welcome. My name is Ben Judah. I'm a Senior Fellow here at the Atlantic Council, speaking to you from Washington, DC. And welcome to the launch of our new report this morning, Stopping the Kleptocrats, a report on what a strategy would look like for the United States and Europe to address this problem, which has been lurking in the headlines, not only for the last year when we've heard of Russian oligarchs and corruption at the heart of the European Parliament, but through the last few decades as it has risen in the world's attention. The report is authored by myself and by my co-author, Francis Shin, and we've got a terrific discussion for you today, a great panel, and I'd love to introduce you to our keynote speaker now, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, who's been a great leader on this topic and the fight against it in the Senate.
Thank you, Ben. Let me start by thanking the Atlantic Council for their terrific work. I'm a big fan of the Council, and it's a pleasure for me to be here with you this morning. I will start with the thesis that informs my work in this space, and that is that in general, Samuel Huntington was right. We are involved in a clash of civilizations, but I believe he defined wrongly the boundaries, the line of contact, if you will, in that clash. In my view, the line of contact in that clash of civilizations is between rule of law nations and nations where a shadowy regime of kleptocracy and criminality controls the public sphere and the politics. I think if you look back through recent history, you see that most of the terrible evils that have occurred, that have affected America, have emerged from those non-rule of law, even anti-rule of law nations. And I'm fresh back from Ukraine, where I very strongly believe that the illegal aggression of Vladimir Putin was abetted and sustained by a corrupt oligarchy of which he is a significant part. And part of our effort in that war has been to do battle with that corrupt oligarchy, power up the ability of the United States through kleptocapture and other means to seize their assets, and in a recent victory to allow those seized assets to be transferred to Ukraine for rebuilding and other purposes. In this clash of civilizations, hidden money is both an asset and a weapon of the other side, of the anti-rule of law powers. They can steal enormous amounts of wealth for themselves, and then they want to secure it behind rule of law protections, and they need to secure it anonymously. So by providing anonymous rule of law protection to their ill-gotten gains, America is in effect aiding and abetting or giving aid and comfort to our enemies across this clash of civilizations. So it is definitely time to address that problem. And this question that we're talking about today of stopping the kleptocracy has really important national security implications, ones which I think the Biden administration understands, and we hope that they can move forward with even more programmatic countermeasures against this kleptocracy and the dark economy around the world that sustains it. Ideally, whether it is through a transatlantic anti-corruption council or a global anti-corruption council or other measures, it would be very good to get to a place where sheltering anonymously the funds of criminals and kleptocrats is as unacceptable in the international community as child labor. And if we get to that point, then I think the world will have a much brighter future than where anti-law regimes allow danger to the rest of the world to fester and to grow. We've had some progress. The Corporate Transparency Act, which opened up the shell corporations of America to FinCEN scrutiny, passed, but not without contest. FinCEN is right now working on a rulemaking to limit money laundering through real estate. We've powered up FinCEN itself with an additional $22.3 million in the Ukraine supplemental, and $67 million for the Department of Justice's kleptocrats operation, which coordinates among the major cabinet agencies to try to bring focus to this effort to seize foreign corrupt assets. And the Asset Seizure for Ukraine Reconstruction Act passed in the last omnibus with help from Senator Graham, Senator Blumenthal, and Senator Bennett. Graham and Blumenthal were my companions on the recent trip to Ukraine. And that bill mattered enough that President Zelensky called Republican leader Mitch McConnell to ask him to free it up and move it in the bill. So thank you, President Zelensky. I'll make one observation about the US politics related to this, which is that America, Washington, has a very powerful apparatus of corporate influence that is brought to bear on Congress more or less constantly. And the dark money enterprise, the dark international economy, has interests in the United States that support it, that participate in it, that are paid considerable sums for their role in making sure that these foreign entities are able to hide their identities and protect their assets. So when you come after the infrastructure of international shadow economy, you find that adversaries pop up against you that may seem a bit surprising. When we tried to open up the shell corporations, the first adversary was the US Chamber of Commerce, of all things. And we were able to convince their banking members and others that this was a very, very poor idea. They were having a very hard time explaining and justifying their position to begin with. And so they went back to neutral. And as they went back to neutral, the American Bar Association stood up. And they had an equal problem, and we worked with their banking and anti-money laundering and other groups to force a realization on the leadership's part that this was a very bad position to be in. And they went back to neutral. And then the National Federation of Independent Businesses stood up. And thankfully, by then, Senators Grassley and Graham had enough of this, and we just got the bill passed. But the sequential opposition of these various corporate groups to protect the industries and interests that are serving foreign kleptocrats and criminals is one of the unpleasant pieces of dealing with this issue. We are, if you see this in the national security context that I began with, we are allowing them to give aid and comfort to our enemies and to aid and abet international criminality, and that should stop. So we have a good deal of work to do ahead of us to make sure that whether you're a lawyer or an accountant or an investment advisor or a hedge fund manager or a realtor or a yacht broker, you are accountable to the similar money laundering and transparency requirements that banks have operated successfully under for years and that we have now applied to America's shell corporations. In this battle, Stopping Kleptocracy is a very important report, and because there can't be leakage, we have to have all the countries of the world move forward together to close off access to criminal and kleptocrat money. The notion of either transatlantic or global anti-corruption councils is a very useful notion. So I'll close with my appreciation to Ben for his report and to the Atlantic Council for its continuing good work. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Senator Whitehouse, for your stirring remarks and for your reminder, to quote President Biden, that there's no longer a bright line dividing foreign and domestic politics. I'd like now to move to the second part of our event, which is this terrific panel discussion that I've really been looking forward to, and I'm going to be moderating. So I'd like to introduce all of our four terrific panelists in turn. Joining us first on the screen here, or for you at home directly, virtually on your own screen, is Gerald Knaus, the chairman of the European Stability Initiative, who's done loads of really pioneering work on corruption and how to stop it in European institutions. Right, sort of next to the screen is Dr. Alina Rybakova, the Deputy Chief Economist at the Institute for International Finance, who's one of the leaders in her field. Next to her is Matt Duss, who is currently the visiting scholar at the American Statecraft Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and was previously the foreign policy advisor to Bernie Sanders, and again has played a huge role in this field. And last but by no means least is Lakshmi Kumar, the policy director of Global Financial Integrity and one of the leading experts on this topic. So I'm really kind of honoured that you can all join us here today to discuss this report and the themes around it. So I'd like to begin with you, Alina. Obviously, conversations right now are dominated both in Washington and internationally when it comes to foreign policy about Ukraine, the contest with Russia, and how to support Ukraine. I'd love to ask you, how is kleptocracy tied up in that? How is kleptocracy fundamentally part of how the Kremlin does politics and all of the politics that flow from that?
Thank you so much, Ben, and fellow participants. And we couldn't have a better stage setting than Senator Whitehouse's presentation address today, because, you know, the first question, how kleptocracy brought us the war here. I mean, I think that's something we have to address. You know, why we're having the war on Ukraine. There are a lot of pretexts that Putin has been very successful at using. NATO expansion, you know, some national unity with Ukraine. But the reality is that there's been a corrupt regime in Russia for many years. It's been getting progressively more corrupt. And at this stage, it's becoming dangerous for itself. So people in Russia have been resisting the regime. In Belarus, we've seen changes. In Ukraine, we've seen a dramatic change. So at some point, Putin's regime is thinking that, wait a second, I will not be able to survive. What can I come up with? Oh, external threat. A war. What better than a war to try to unite people around me? But the reality is, all I'm trying to do is protect my corruptly or earned money, you know, the rent-seeking behavior that allowed me to accumulate billions in wealth, you know, the secret wealth of Putin. You know, we talk a lot about the oligarchs, but there is also the clique around him that are enjoying this, the benefits of the Russian oil and gas and other commodity exports. So I think it's very important to remember it's not a small issue somewhere, kleptocracy here, kleptocracy there. No, kleptocracy in Russia has brought us the war. And I think that's the first one. The second one, kleptocracy in Russia, but not only, as we know there are no borders, is preventing us from implementing sanctions more constructively, more effectively. And I think if last year, 2022, was all about implementing this fantastic multilateral sanctions on Russia and different packages, including in Europe, this year has to be about implementation. And if we're not going after the secret sort of hidden channels of the financial sector transfers or the trade transfers, we won't be able successfully implementing the sanctions against Russia.
Thank you, Alina. I'd love to turn to you now, Gerald, joining us from, where in Europe are you, Gerald, this morning?
Hi, Ben. Hello, everyone at the Atlantic Council. I'm in Strasbourg at the moment, literally next to the Council of Europe, where there's been a debate to commemorate one of the worst moments in this institution's history, and it's linked to corruption. Well,
I thought you might be in one of the seats of the European Parliament, which brings us to a question that's really been on my mind, I know on the mind of our your fellow panelists and of the audience, both here and virtually, which is, what's the state of play when it comes to weaponized corruption in Europe right now? We've heard tell of serious scandals rocking the European Parliament to its core. You're right by the Council of Europe. Tell us what's at stake here and what's been going on.
Well, thank you, Ben. Perhaps I should just start by explaining a word on the debate we had yesterday. So the Council of Europe is the oldest European body whose task it is to defend human rights. It has 46 members. Russia was expelled far too late, almost 1 year ago, but 46 members, and it's linked to the European Court of Human Rights that is supposed to protect citizens against their governments. And in the case of autocracies like Azerbaijan, this is very much needed. And 10 years ago, in this very place in Strasbourg, exactly on the 23rd of January, there was the most shameful debate in the history of this institution when 125 members of parliaments from across Europe voted that there were no political prisoners in Azerbaijan. delivering a victory to the Aliyev regime, for which the Aliyev regime had lobbied for more than a decade. At the time, we, my colleagues and myself, had already written a report on caviar diplomacy, and we followed up because we were so shocked by this debate with 20 more papers and many more reports until 2017 to expose what we felt was an incredibly open capture of one international institution, where parliamentarians from Spain, the UK, Italy, France, and of course, other countries were regularly invited on very expensive holidays, where election observers received envelopes with cash in hotels here in Strasbourg, where people got up and said the most outrageous things defending Azerbaijan and turned up to votes. All of this was obvious to us, and when we investigated, we had insiders explaining to us what people received, but there was no reaction for 5 years. And by early 2017, the key people who'd been apologists for the Aliyev regime, and by the way, many of them also very close to Putin's regime, to Leonid Slutsky, who was a member here, and to Pushkov, who was the leader of the Russian delegation. They controlled this institution. Now, we wrote more and more reports, but the break came, and that's my major lesson for this debate. The break came when prosecutors in one member state did their work, and that was Italian prosecutors in Milan. So if you ask me, how is the state of fighting the corruption of European politicians, active politicians in our parliaments in Europe, the key question must be, where are prosecutors? And in fact, as in the case of the European Parliament scandal at this very moment, the Secret Service of Belgium, where are they willing to actually investigate when the evidence of corruption by outside autocratic powers is obvious? And to round this up, the sad reality is that in most cases, where autocracies like Russia, Azerbaijan, and in the case of the European Parliament, the debate is now on Qatar, Morocco, also Kazakhstan, and again, of course, Azerbaijan and Russia, where they bribe over many years, corrupt, and then also make likely to be blackmailed politicians across Europe, there is far too little awareness by our authorities to react. So of all the more than 100 people, I estimate, MPs from across Europe, who took money from Azerbaijan, just in this institution, in the Council of Europe in the last 20 years, so far, only one Italian was sentenced in first instance. So when you hear about this big discovery of transfers of billions of money, the laundromat, via banks, shell companies, or accounts, all of this transfer of money did not lead to any investigation or sentencing of anyone, because prosecutors have not been willing to go the way the Italians have gone. And my major conclusion from this is that if we are serious about fighting the corruption of our elites, the capture of our institutions by outside autocratic powers, the key thing we need is not only a vigilant civil society, media, think tanks who write about it, but in the end, an awareness in our executives, in the secret services, in the prosecution services, that this is a national security threat. If we don't have that awareness, even discovering the tracing the money, will not lead to reactions. All those people who received money via the laundromat, which was discovered in September 2017, none of them had any consequences.
Thank you, Gerald, for that kind of shocking précis of what's been happening in one of Europe's oldest human rights institutions. So we've heard from Alina about how the nature of the Putin regime is tied up from kleptocracy. And we've heard from Gerald about how kleptocracy has staged practical takeovers of important institutions. I'd like to turn to you now, Lakshmi, to understand what are the legal holes that the kleptocrats are getting through? What are the main open doors that you see as a kind of leading authority on this that we need to close?
I think, the biggest loophole has always been it's a mix between a lack of interest to enforce existing laws and the absence of laws in itself. And I think that's what, when we're sort of talking about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that's what it suddenly, brought to the spotlight, is the absence of laws, that we have to sort of target the myriad ways through which kleptocrats move money and hide money. So, I think in the immediate wake, there was interest in, okay, where are the yachts going? Who owns the yachts? Where is real estate? Who owns that real estate? How did Abramovich's hedge investment fund manage to maybe invest close to like $1 billion all over the world? And that's when you ask those questions, you suddenly realize, oh, we don't have the laws that actually require this information, to put down this information, to go after it. And if you look to the rest of Europe, they have the laws, but no one's done really very much anything in terms of enforcing it. And at the heart of it, really at the heart of all of it, is we talk about the modes and methods and vehicles, but at the heart of it, it is people that help other people illicitly move money. It's not like me trying to buy a house. I go from DC across 10 homes to find one that works, to see, is the roof leaking? Is there this problem? Is that when you are as wealthy as the people that we're talking about, you're hiring professionals. And so at the heart of it, it is an institutional setup that is both professionals, laws, and institutions that have never actually had to do anything about it, and there's been no impetus to do anything about it, because it isn't our problem. These problems exist elsewhere, and we don't feel at least we seemingly don't seem to think there are consequences of importing these problems into our countries. And I think flipping that switch and changing the narrative to understand that we too face the consequences, I think, may be critical to plug everything that we're talking about. Also, I should say congratulations, Ben and Francis, on an excellent report.
Oh, thank you. That's much too kind. I want to turn to you now, Matt, talk about the politics of anti-kleptocracy here in the United States. There was a real moment of optimism at the beginning of the Biden administration. This was finally being picked up and taken seriously. Do you think this has run out of steam?
I don't know if I'd say run out of steam, but let's just go back to that moment that you're talking about. I think part of what was really encouraging about 2020 was the extent to which I think you saw the issue of anti-kleptocracy, corruption, really taken on board as a core element of the threat to democracy. And I think this plays into the kind of theory of the case that we need to end the siloing of foreign versus domestic. I think you saw this reflected in a number of speeches and statements in the 2020 Democratic Party platform, in Joe Biden's foreign affairs, his first big, on the campaign trail, foreign policy, kind of statement, which featured anti-corruption very heavily. But I think since then, it's often the case that, presidents have to respond to crises of the moment. They don't get to do the full agenda of what they campaigned on. But still, there's nothing new about having to prioritize. I would say, if you look at the national security strategy that came out in the late summer, I read that and I was really disappointed at the lack of attention paid to anti-corruption, anti-kleptocracy. I think it got one or two mentions in the body of the strategy, and then they had a kind of text box that said, yes, oh, by the way, anti-corruption, very important. I'm glad it made it in there. But it didn't seem that this was kind of integrated into the kind of vision or at least prioritized to the way that they had previously said. And I would also note, they named a special coordinator for anti-corruption, Richard Nephew, very capable, very smart, expert, but seating him at the State Department is itself a statement about this is an out there problem. It is a global problem. It is a foreign policy problem. And I think, getting to some of what Senator Whitehouse said, this is not just an out there problem. This is a very much in here problem. As you note in your report, this money is being stashed in real estate in Miami and New York. It's being, run through trusts in South Dakota, Nevada. And I think this is where, if you're going to really confront this problem, and this is where I think the Biden administration has run out of steam, is that you're going to have to pick fights with American political constituencies that have enormous influence. And thus far, I haven't seen much evidence that they're ready to do that.
Thank you, Matt, for kind of explaining the politics here in Washington, D.C. to us. I'd like to come back to you, Elena, based on what we've just heard, so many open doors, so much of a lack of enforcement happening on kleptocracy, what's it mean for enforcing Russia sanctions? How are we going to be able to maintain the effectiveness of this very, very complicated legal system if we haven't cleared up the kleptocracy problem as it stands?
Well, thank you. It's just like Matt said, it's not out there problem, it's in here problem. And I think we've done a lot of conversations about sanctions last year, effectiveness, are they having an impact or not? But we're completely forgetting that we cannot silo that out from anti-corruption, anti-kleptocracy measures. Because what happens, Russia has about, let's say, 300-400 billion in exports and something similar in imports. These are large amounts. The current account surpluses of Russia have ranged between, say, 10 billion to last year, 220 billion. These are big amounts, but it's not North Korea. They're not circulating inside Russia. They're mostly in foreign exchange. They're mostly flowing out and in of the country. So that means there is somebody on the other side. So who is on the other side? For Russia, important trade partners used to be, and to some extent still are, it is Europe, US, now it's China becoming more important, it's Turkey, but the money have to be sort of, I would at this stage say, laundered somewhere. So they have to be abroad, including in foreign correspondent financial institutions and potentially, maybe under-invoicing and over-invoicing of the trade transaction, which then obfuscates the capital flows. So for us to be able to enforce the sanctions, and let me remind the audience which are the most important sanctions, right? So we've done the financial sector sanctions, which sort of de-swifting some of the banks and taking over supposedly the 300 billion of Russian reserves. Then we've done some export control measures, and up until recently, we haven't touched the crown jewel, which is export of energy, but we are beginning to do that with the embargo and the oil price cap. So then looking at 2023, we want to implement all of those measures, right? With oil price cap, for example, the change of the $10 per barrel gives Russia more than $20 billion. So if we squeeze it from 60 to 50, it's $20 billion. So there could be, and we're already seeing evidence of companies popping up internationally, pretending to work under the price cap, but instead they might do God knows what if we have no way of tracing these companies. So already now we see a whole range of new companies that I'm not even familiar with their names, and generally those who work on Russia, they're familiar. There is Rosneft, Gazprom Neft, there are very few companies, state controls that tend to export oil. But if I look there are suddenly completely new names that tend to be exporting oil. What is this company? But of course, this company must have accounts abroad. It must have transactions with foreign companies abroad. So if we do not trace it from our side, we will not be able to implement these sanctions. The same applies to export controls. We already see a big impact from the export controls from the US, chips and Europe. But we see chips flowing from Turkey. And then, of course, also from China. So again, we need to be able to have a reach legally and implementation-wise to be able to implement sanctions. Otherwise, it's just thin air. It's something that we mentioned. We had a lot of press coverage and then has no impact.
Thank you, Alina. That's really concerning. I'd like to turn back to you, Gerald. I was really struck by what you said about the complete lack of prosecutions that have emerged from these shocking scandals in Europe. I've got quite a simple question. Why? Why have there been no prosecutions when the evidence seems so overwhelming and what it means for national security and the integrity of our institutions is so clear?
Yes, that is the key question. And I think it points us towards a major challenge for anybody who wants to confront effectively this autocratic capture. The enablers you talk about in your report, and you mention, of course, politicians as well, that are most damaging are the elected politicians in our democracies. And in order to rein them in, what you need is public outrage. If you don't have public outrage, what I have found, if things are seen as it's okay to give you an example, to become a German MP in the Bundestag, and in your first 2 weeks in the Bundestag, you set up a consulting company, and then you do consulting services for whoever. And there is no sense that certain clients should be unacceptable. If this is not considered a problem, what I notice is that prosecutors, of course, are always overburdened in all countries. They need to prioritize. And very clearly, investigating the corruption of MPs of national parliaments that then vote, for example, in the Council of Europe, has not been a priority for prosecutors. When it was in Italy, when Italian prosecutors in Milan found that there was a senior Italian member of parliament in Italy and here in Strasbourg, who had received 2.4 million euros on his bank account that he couldn't explain, and who then explained that in fact he had a contract for 10 million euros, one MP, and he said he was providing consulting services to Azerbaijan. When these Italian prosecutors then did a raid on his office and found the email exchange, only at that stage was there the evidence to be able to bring him and two Azerbaijanis before the court in Milan, because the email exchange very clearly indicated or suggested, because they were talking about, I will mobilize MPs. When do I get my reward? Thank you for the juicy presents. And also, let's look forward to the next meeting with the Russians, the Azerbaijanis, and their friends in Europe in Baku. It was clear from the email exchanges that money was transferred. And in first instance, it's still on appeal, but in first instance, this Italian politician was sentenced to jail. But without the prosecutors raiding his office and making this a priority for themselves, nothing would have come out. And now look at the European scandal in the European Parliament. It is because an intelligence service, from what we've learned, an intelligence service warned Belgium, and then the Belgians decided to prosecute on the basis that this corruption by outside powers, what we've been hearing in the press, what I hear in Brussels, the Moroccan Foreign Intelligence Service, the Qatari government and others are mentioned. The Belgians actually said this was a serious threat to security, which justified intense measures in terms of doing house searches, finding the 300,000 euros in 50 euro bills in the houses or apartments of members of the European Parliament, eavesdropping, listening to them, and putting together the evidence. If you don't have public agencies willing to do that research, then these are the perfect crimes. The people who took money from Azerbaijan here in the last 20 years in Strasbourg, or indeed in other countries, and these are all members of national parliaments of our democracies in Spain, in France, in Germany, in Italy and elsewhere, they got away with it. Azerbaijan got away with it. There was no sanctioning. So creating a sense, and this is why I'm so happy about this opportunity and your report and your work, creating a sense that this matters, that this is a matter of shame, that politicians shouldn't take envelopes with money and prosecutors should take this seriously, is something that we need to do in civil society and in the media. And one more thing, on Ukraine and on Russia's war, why was Russia not deterred early 2022, 1 year ago in January? Why did it not believe that the Europeans and others would react strongly? Well, look at who was on the boards of Russian companies, openly, not secretly, in early 2002. A former German chancellor, a former French prime minister, a former Austrian chancellor, leading politicians from Italy, from the Netherlands, from Finland, former commissioners, all of them on the boards of state companies or companies very close to the state, Rosneft, Lukoil, banks. And of course, in the Kremlin, the sense was, if we can buy openly the creme de la creme of European politicians, if an Austrian foreign minister gets openly invites Mr. Putin to her wedding and then receives a 50,000 euro expensive set of earrings and is allowed to keep them after she resigns from the foreign ministry. If François Fillon can set up a consultancy company and while calling for sanctions against Russia to be lifted already years ago when he was about to become a candidate to become French president, and then, of course, working for Russian companies, if we accept this as acceptable in our public opinion, then we shouldn't be surprised that autocracies do not believe we are serious about confronting them. So generating a sense of shame, explaining that this money that buys politicians in office or just after they leave office is not innocent, that this is undermining the core of our ability to resist this murderous agenda, in the case of Ukraine, a genocidal war, unless we manage to get the public to see that this is a threat, all technical reforms will fail. Only once we have this sense of outrage and shame will prosecutors, will state agencies focus the attention that this deserves.
Thank you, Gerald. I think that really puts things in stark contrast. I want to turn to you, Lakshmi, to give us a sense of where things are in Washington, D.C. What are the laws that we need to pass? What's the state of play in Congress in terms of the bills that could begin tackling some of this? And do we have the same problem when it comes to prosecution and enforcement? You know, what could be done about it there?
So as far as, legislative efforts have been, the big victory that, took place in 2020 was for us getting beneficial ownership across the board. And since then, the actual law has yet to come into effect because it's going through a series of rulemaking. So we've had the second rule, which came out at the end of last year, which is due for comment. And so the hope is that, because that it will be a critical piece of legislation and infrastructure to actually go about tackling this. Now, that was a 10-year fight to get it to go, to sort of get it across the finish line. The legislative piece that really sort of gathered steam and generated a lot of interest during the Russian invasion of Ukraine was the enablers legislation. Prior to that, no one really thought there was interest within Congress to go after, the various professionals and intermediaries that are responsible for helping move money across. Now, that didn't get passed, but what was positive at the end of last year is when Transparency International had their large anti-corruption summit, is that the administration voiced its support for the legislation and endorsed it. So, when we start talking about legislative pieces, that would be critical. We also have, legislative pieces that have already been passed but have been yet to been put into effect. For instance, in 2018, the Coast Guard was responsible to sort of frame rules to collect beneficial ownership information on yachts and large recreational vessels. Nothing really has come to that. The US remains the #1 place in the world to register private airplanes. And everyone that owns a private airplane or rents it is close to being a millionaire. It costs about $5 to do it. You still don't really collect beneficial ownership information. And there have been, I think Senator Whitehouse's teams did put together legislation to try and move that across the board. We haven't really seen any of that happen. At the same time, FinCEN had set out earlier a notice, an advanced proposal for rulemaking around the real estate sector. And it was part of the White House summit strategy on corruption, on how to counter corruption, which was to focus on beneficial ownership, real estate, and investment funds. So we've seen a notice for rulemaking. We haven't actually seen a draft rule yet come to fruition. We've heard that it might be possible in the coming year. We're crossing our fingers. And so, but the reality is we are so reactive in how we have done our legislative and rulemaking and passing laws, is that by the time this comes into effect and goes on the board and we actually start collecting information, we're looking at things a couple of years down the line. And I think what we really need to think about, whether it's in the US and elsewhere, is that we recognize this is a problem, and you don't need something that grabs eyeballs to actually do something about it, because then you're only starting to solve the problem long after the problem, once the problem has become deeply entrenched or after the problem has ceased to exist, at which point then the question again comes, is there steam to actually go ahead and enforce this? So I think in the US there are all these pieces of legislation that there's garnered interest because of the Russian invasion. I think it's important to see that we follow through, we implement, especially something like the enablers, real estate, investment funds and beneficial ownership. Those are sort of the four big things. But the last thing I will say is over and above all of this, as much as we talk, you can pass a gazillion laws. None of it really means anything unless you equip the government agencies responsible with the resources to do what they need to do. I think there are some, Transparency International put out a study last year or the year before that showed, the US is the largest economy in the world, but it is amongst the most under-resourced financial intelligence units in the world. And this cuts across multiple government agencies. So more than, so when we start talking about prosecution and going after, that's a secondary issue. I think the primary issue is actually providing resources, staffing, updating technology. A lot of government departments, especially FinCEN, have incredibly outdated technology. So you aren't providing the resources to go after, so passing laws doesn't entirely solve the problem. It is also concomitantly ensuring that resources are bulked up, more staff is hired, technology is improved. Then you can also talk about, then is the question about, okay, how do you go after and enforce and then prosecute? So I would say to think about it through that lens.
Thank you, Lakshmi. That really makes much more sense now, after having you kind of explain it to us. I'd like to ask you a question, Matt, which is, how can this issue really be a priority for the administration when it's dealing with Russia and China? Why should we prioritize this politically? Why are the kind of more hard security people that will say, no, we need to focus on the tanks and we need to focus on the aircraft carriers wrong? Why is this really a front row issue?
Well, I think because it cuts to the core of our ability to govern ourselves democratically. And here, I want to, when listening to Gerald talk about the Azerbaijan situation, I'm hearing him talk, and I'm like, oh, that's familiar. In Washington, we call that campaign finance. I'm not joking. We have a system of legalized bribery that runs our politics in the United States. I want to be very clear about that. You look at even the 2016 Supreme Court decision, the McDonald decision, the Virginia governor who was convicted of bribery for doing favors for a wealthy contributor, in which the Supreme Court unanimously vacated that conviction and essentially defined bribery, political bribery, out of existence. I encourage everyone to go look at that. It is quite staggering. It was the sense that, well, this is just a friend doing a favor for a friend. So I think there's a way of talking about anti-corruption and kleptocracy that we kind of see these kleptocrats out there. They're in Adidas tracksuits and wearing big medallions and floating around on yachts. But I think we need to understand it as, going back to what I said at the beginning, this deals with concentrated wealth, protecting its wealth, protecting its power, and negatively constraining our ability to actually do democracy, whether it's through the kind of classic weaponized corruption that your report talks about so I think effectively and rigorously, but also just the way that concentrations of wealth in various financial sectors in our own country, in developed democracies, work together to protect our own wealth and power. And I think understanding it in those terms is absolutely essential for confronting it. But again, this is a huge political challenge for good reason. These are interests that are deeply embedded and have relationships at all levels of our political system.
Thank you, Matt. That's very stirring what you said, and really identifying the sort of elephant in the room here. So I'd like to open this up to questions from our live and virtual audience. And in the system that we have, please sort of type away in the chat box if you're online. And if you're in the live audience, please put your hand up and an iPad will be sent round for you to type your own question. So I've got first question here, and it happens to be for Gerald. It's a kind of interesting one, actually coming from Brussels. Where does Macron, von der Leyen and Scholz sit on these issues? Do they view it as a priority? So thank you, Francois in Brussels.
Well, I can talk about the Council of Europe first, and then of course the European Parliament and the bigger issue. The Council of Europe, what I described, happened here in Strasbourg, is based in France. And idea, in fact, not more than the idea, the awareness that envelopes with money were being handed out in hotels to election observers. I repeat, always members of national parliaments across Europe who then also come here. This has been known for a very long time. And I struggle to believe that French authorities would not have heard about it if a small NGO like ours has written 20 reports from afar, and then it turned out Italian prosecutors confirmed everything we wrote. How is it possible that French authorities did not see that? Now, of course, much of this happened before President Macron became president, so it's not under his watch. But the reality is that since I have not seen from the great European powers a willingness to actually go to the bottom of this. Give you one example. There's been a prominent politician who's received some money that has arrived through the laundromat for election observation. There have been prominent politicians in Belgium and in France. They did fraudulent election observation, which means they went to autocracies funded by them and then said elections were free and fair when they were clearly stolen. Some of them then went to the Council of Europe. They pushed themselves into election observation missions to Azerbaijan. You ask why they had such an interest. They became even rapporteurs on Azerbaijan. You ask why they were so interested. They then wrote reports and said there weren't really any problems. In that vote 10 years ago on political prisoners, of course, they said there were no political prisoners. All of this was out in the open. And then they were actually named by an investigation in 2018 after the scandal broke finally in 2017. And yet there is no consequence. One of these apologists of Azerbaijan, Thierry Mariani, a former French minister, just switched party. He's now with Le Pen, one of the most prominent politicians in Le Pen's party. He used to be with Sarkozy. If there are no consequences, I really wonder if a scandal of this size breaks finally. And finally, there was a lot of media attention and lots of documentaries made and lots of people coming to say, how could this big scandal happen? But nobody is held accountable. The message really to governments is that this is a perfect crime. And I don't see Germany or France or any of the big countries at the political level realize what a threat this is. I hope that Russia's, it's too late, of course, for Ukraine to prevent that awful war, but at least the shock over this war led to an awareness that all the money that Russian companies, the Russian state has spent, for example, in Germany, where I know it better, this was never innocent. It was always part of an influence operation to create at least passivity, if not outright complicity in different parts of the economic and political sphere. And that led Russia to believe, Putin, to be precise, the Putin regime and Putin's government, that led them to believe they could get away with this. And again, there's been a lot of change following the 24th of February invasion, but I'm not sure there is enough awareness. And perhaps this scandal now, we will see how big it is. One of the questioners said it might not be a big scandal. I'm hearing that it might be much bigger, but of course the key issue is this in the European Parliament. We will see how much will be discovered. But the key problem is it would be naive to believe that if it is possible for a small country like Azerbaijan for 2 decades to bribe politicians and get away with it, that other autocracies are not doing exactly the same all the time with the same low risk of being discovered. And no, it's not high enough on the agenda in Berlin or Paris.
Thank you, Gerald. I've got a question for Lakshmi, which is about technology. What is the technological whole when it comes to fighting kleptocracy? What do these systems look like? You know, in sort of layman's terms, what's missing and what needs to be invested in?
Oh gosh, where do I start? When we're talking about technology, I mean, for instance, let's take something as simple as the new beneficial ownership registry, which at its essence is the ability to collect information about the individual that owns and controls a company. Now, we've seen beneficial ownership registries set up all across Europe. And they've already run into, for these registries to be valuable and useful, the reality is it's not just enough that they're accessible within the domestic law enforcement financial institution apparatus. They should also be accessible internationally, so in a cross-border sense. So making sure your systems are mutually compatible is a big part of it. Now, what we've seen in Europe quickly is that either the systems aren't great, they aren't always mutually compatible, and so you see regulators put in place things that don't necessarily speak to each other. And for something like money laundering, which at its essence is a cross-border illicit activity, which requires the cooperation of two countries, you don't see that happen. The other thing that we've often seen is like when, for example, when the FinCEN leaks came out, it based on available resources at FinCEN, those calculations were done. It was said that, every employee at FinCEN would have to work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to individually process all the suspicious activity reports that are coming. Now, converse this, this was a great example, and I will not take credit for it. It's actually my boss, Tom Cardamone, who used it. It's like, if you look at Facebook is able to, when it wants to collect information on you, it is able to scrape its database of everything it needs, how it needs, when it needs. So there's the question of why are we, therefore, as FIUs, unable to simply process the volume of data that's coming through. And this is just not unique to the US. This we see across the board, is that a lot of times you see in countries, and this is also very much a product of the weakest link. There are some countries in place which act as channels for this money to go through, where some of this is still paper-based. Other countries where this is automated, but it is so backward that it is heavily dependent on, an individual going through, as opposed to having sort of big data comb through this. And so, those are just fundamental challenges that can really only be solved by actually putting resources towards this. And I think the last thing, again, on sort of the technological side of all of this is when we are talking about the exchange of information through mutual legal assistance. That is both a product of putting resources, but not just technological, but also technical resources towards the same things. Because a lot of the stop you see, what prevents cases from going to prosecution, especially in a cross-border situation, is often really delays and lags in information going from one country to another.
Thank you. That's really, really interesting and really concerning that we still got such a deeply dysfunctional system, despite knowing about this for many, many years. I saw you nodding in agreement or in disagreement, I don't know, but I saw you nodding there, Alina.
No, I think what's important, we shouldn't undermine our authorities, because we do have fantastic, masters in data science coming out now. We have international community, we have this fantastic Atlantic Council and your work, Ben. We should have the data, which is sort of doesn't undermine individual company sort of business interest, but we should make it available to a broader group of analysts. For example, you mentioned Twitter. The Russian trolls release, that was sort of, for example, I can run relatively quickly, the analysis on the Russian trolls and then extrapolate and try to find the new ones. But unfortunately, I have only one release. There is no public information that regularly requires them to clean it out and put it into the public domain, the ones that they have removed, so that there is international community and the domestic community in the US can go through the data and produce research and draw attention and help the authorities. Because, as Lakshmi pointed out, there are limited resources naturally, and of course we have to strengthen them, but we should also help them with legislation that makes this information available, and also with the international public analyst community that will be happy to work on this data, provide the analysis, and they can incorporate it in their work. What worries me even more, that in European Union at the moment, you have different member states. Member states are responsible for implementation of sanctions. But within the member states that will have different institutions, maybe Ministry of Finance, maybe Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And one country, in one company we have anecdotal evidence, got 7 different letters from different institutions within one country suggesting different implementation of a sanction. That, I mean, and then at that stage, the country that is working multinationally, you know, some of them say, look, we write a letter to OFAC, we get a response from them, we don't even ask Europeans, because God forbid we're going to get 25 different letters with different recommendations, and definitely we cannot do anything. So for European Union, it's very important to come up with some sort of agreement, either it's a coordination or maybe European-wide sanctions implementation authority. On top of that, beneficial ownership that has to be, to an extent possible, made public, that then international sort of analyst community can help them do their job better.
Thank you, Alina. I think that sounds like a really good policy idea to kind of start coordinating all of this more on the European level. I've got a question here from the virtual audience for Matt, and then I think I'll pose it to everyone else as well, which is from Zoe Rater. And the question is, you know, given the steep hill to climb when it comes to dark money and corporate capture in American politics, but also European politics to a certain extent. What are your ideas for reform? How can we tilt the playing field away from them? I'd love to ask all of the panelists that question, actually.
Sure. I mean, first of all, you need leaders in Congress who are willing to kind of take this up. Obviously, you know, my old boss, Senator Sanders, along with Senator Warren and a number of others, Senator Whitehouse, who can not only kind of press the issue, but also articulate why this is such a problem for our democracy, why it's a problem for our security. You're going to need legislation. You're going to run into, I mean, I think, again, what I said about the Supreme Court previously, they have made clear their views on the kind of legality of money as political speech. At least in a domestic context. But I also think there is just no substitute for a presidential leadership. The president needs to carve out time on his agenda to make the case to the American people why committing resources and energy and time on this issue, among all the other challenges that we face globally and domestically, is absolutely necessary. And I very much, you know, there's no way around that.
Thanks, Matt. Lakshmi, what's your idea about how we can tilt the playing field in favour of reform?
I will say I'm an eternal optimist, though I realize I've spent the last majority of my remarks talking about everything that isn't quite right. I am an eternal optimist. And what I do think has happened is, you know, we have slowly but surely made positive inroads in this fight. I mean, like 5 years ago, you had, 5 to 10, even 10 years ago, there were very few countries that were interested in beneficial ownership registries or even knew what it was. Today, we have over 100 countries committing to do something to it. And I think with all of this, there has to be an understanding that you're only as strong as your weakest link. Because the nature of illicit financial flows and the nature of money laundering is, if you close one country or one loophole, the money will jump elsewhere. And that's what we've seen. You know, if it's not here, it jumps to the UAE. And if it's not the UAE, because we went after them for, you know, the illicit gold trade, then Turkey will open up its gold markets. And so there is always somewhere. So there really has to be much greater international accountability on all of this and better use, for example, like, you know, platforms like the FATF. But I will say with that, I think there is also this larger concern that emerges is that, you know, when we're talking about the international application of AML rules, is it one-sided? Do some countries get let off easier? Do some countries, you know, get a pass? You know, for example, like the UK was given the most highest FATF ratings possible when it's had its evaluation a couple of years ago. And then, you know, on the back of it, we've seen everything that happens. So I think when we think about accountability, is much more sort of international accountability and making sure that the rules and standards we do have is something that, you know, we all are committed to. There is equal enforcement, and there is I think a much more deeper and intrinsic understanding of the harms that come from this. You said, you know, when we have money, import illicit money, there is no harm. We don't escape the harms. And I think making sure that we understand that the harms are universal is, I think, a big component of it as well.
Thank you, Lakshmi. Alina, what's your ideas so we can tilt the field in the direction of reform, both against dark money at home and Russian corruption more internationally?
Well, I think we need to elevate it to the national security threat level. So I often ask the question, sanctions, are they working or they're not working? There is sort of European economic suffering versus the Russian economic suffering. But I think it misses the point because we compartmentalize it too much. It's not just about economics. It's on one hand, we're discussing the tanks to Ukraine, and multi-billion packages of weapons from the US as well. On the other hand, we're enabling Russia laundering the same billions. So we're giving with one hand and we're taking away with the other. And we need to think about it comprehensively. It's part of the same national security strategy, which includes economic statecraft and sanctions, also includes the defense and foreign policy objectives, and also includes the financial flows. We cannot think about it independently. So the cost of the war, sort of the cost of the sanctions is not just the cost of the economic cost of sanctions, it's the cost of potential war further down, whether it's Baltics, whether it's Poland, Moldova, or any of the European countries. So I think that should be not just a friend giving a friend a favor. No, I am potentially financing the Russian aggression on Ukraine quite physically and quite literally. And it should have those kind of consequences when that happens, not just sort of, oh, it's it's a bit of kleptocracy, it's not a big problem. No, it's a national security threat.
Thank you. Well, Gerald, what can be done in the European context to tilt the field in favour of reform and to advance this cause?
Well, I think a lot of what the other panelists said applies everywhere. It is a fight, and it needs to be seen as a fight that autocratic governments try to undermine a democratic rule-based system. One way in which they try to do that is to bribe politicians or to win over people with good connections and the ability to sway politics through money. But it is important to also look at the bright side in all of this. It shows that these institutions that we have matter. That's why they are a target. It shows that even shaming can still work, because why would governments spend money in the Council of Europe, which actually issues declarations on human rights, if these declarations wouldn't matter if they are critical? And in all these institutions, while there are some politicians that are willing to go on the board of Russian or Saudi or other autocratic companies of autocratic states, there are other politicians who fight all of this. And one of the most energizing emotions I felt yesterday here, I was sitting with two members of a Dutch politician, Peter Omtzigt, who'd been fighting corruption by Azerbaijan, who fights for the rule of law in Poland, who's been fighting to clarify scandals hitting the vulnerable in his own country, the Netherlands, who's been fighting against the collusion in the case of the killed journalist in Malta. He was a few years ago a Christian Democrat when the most of the Christian Democratic group here was all behind Azerbaijan, many of them, including its leadership. And he fought. He said this is unacceptable. And he teamed up with a social democrat and a liberal who felt the same way. And I think in the end, it's up to us as citizens, the public, the media, the think tanks, to help those inside the institutions that see what is wrong and are prepared to fight. And this will only work if those who fight corruption receive recognition, because in democracy, in the end, they also need to be re-elected. And if civil society and the media and us in the think tank, in the talking community, keep raising the importance of this issue as a security threat, because it tries to undermine the foundation that makes democracy strong, which is the belief that in the end, the rules that we make publicly and transparently matter and apply to everyone. And if this confidence disappears, democracies become very vulnerable. And that's why the far right, of course, is so susceptible to this collusion with autocrats, because it wants to destroy the system that we have.
Thank you, Gerald. But also thank you to all of my panellists. I've been alternately shocked, inspired and enlightened. Thank you for joining us this morning. Before we move on to the next part of our event, a round of applause, please. So that's only the end of the second part of our event, because I'm delighted to be joined here today by His Excellency Krum Zarkov, the Minister of Justice of the Republic of Bulgaria. Thank you so much for joining us in person this morning to talk about what international kleptocracy means for you as a minister in an EU member state.
Yeah, thank you, Ben, and thank Atlantic Council for this event and for this report. As a Minister of Justice of Bulgaria, a country which is member of the EU and which is in the middle of another big reform to establishing the highest standard of rule of law, I'm often thinking about the reasons which make possible to kleptocrats to sometimes to win. In your report, which is excellent, by the way, and
thank you,
with deep insight and very good proposals, you ask, why do they win? And I'm keen to ask, how do they do it? And listening to the panelists and all this excellent discussion, I want to bring forward some thoughts. You know, in the beginning, it's always a crime. One should understand that. In the beginning, it's a crime, it's a bribe, it's a distortion, it's a public procurement who has been won in an illegal matter, it's a falsified tender, it's something. And when this crime is not investigated as it should be, when it's not punished, this crime became crimes. It became systematic. When those crimes became systematic, they entered politics, either by financing party or by creating their own party, by investing in some personalities. They're penetrating our democratic institution, our representativity. And you may see it all the way. When they enter in politics, if there is not a system of political opposition to them, they're winning elections. And when they win election, they capture the state. And this is how they win. When they capture one state, it's not enough, they're going abroad. If it is a powerful state that has been captured, it's going to pose a global threat. If it is a smaller or a medium state, they're going abroad to hide their property, infesting the assets of other states. So this is how it goes. When we know the diagnosis, I think that we have clear medicine. On the first level, we need law enforcement, laws and the implementation of laws. In Bulgaria, we're in the middle of making some of those laws happen. By the way, when I was hearing your panelists, we have pretty much the same problem everywhere. For example, we need in Bulgaria to have judicial review on the decision of a prosecutor not to prosecute. You know, it's not like in the US. In Bulgaria, the prosecutor office is part of the judiciary. The executive, me as a Minister of Justice, I cannot interfere in their work. So when they decide not to go after someone, it's over. And sometimes it poses a problem. So this is the first step. But because it will affect all the states, we should know that other state has the right to look and to overview your judicial system, because it's treating them if it's not working well. In the European Union, we have the so-called annual report mechanism of the rule of law, who is making survey of every single state about the standards to be respected. Then we have the next level, politics. Wealthy persons are entering politics sometimes with filthy wealth. And we need a stable democratic system with which parties ideologically clear, because you may recognize someone who is entering in politics like an adventurist. He is a populist. He is promising whatever it takes. He does not care about the responsibility of his proposal. You have heard them in the United States, in Europe, everywhere. Someone who comes on the TV screen and just say, listen, vote for me and I will take the salaries, try 3 times bigger, and so on and so on, although he knows it's impossible because it's not to govern he wants. He wants to hide his wealth via the state institutions. So we need clear and transparent democratic system with political parties which are financed in a manner that leaves no doubt, and which are, how to say, embedded in democracy. And then you have the next level, the interstate level and the interatlantic level. I very much welcome the proposal made in the report for such a council. but we must open our eyes. We have tax havens. You know, we are speaking in your report about loopholes. What more? It's more than a loophole, a tax haven. It's an efficient isle of irregularity in the sea of regulation, officially, with the support of the most powerful nations. When you have this, you cannot have an effective system against kleptocracy, because you have decided to have a Tortuga Island somewhere to hide what is to be hidden. So if our leaders open their eyes on the highest level, I am certain that it will be repercussions on all of them. One last sentence for my country. You know, in Bulgaria, we have been through 30 years of transition from communist state to the democracy and the market economy one, and we saw on our back how it may be hurting the people to have a state which is not at the level of the expectation. And that's why I'm here in the United States, working with all our partners under the initiative launched by Joe Biden 2 years ago, the Summit for Democracy, where Bulgaria is leading a cohort of states against corruption, and corruption seen as a threat to national security. So this is the strategic level of our work, and I'm certain that we will have results. Like one of your panelists said, we should all be optimistic, but to be optimistic, we should be ready to give a fight. And this fight is more and more painful, closer it is to the battle. It is quite more easier to fight corruption on the global level than to fight it in your neighborhood. So this is my message to every single one of us. We have to know what's happening on the global, but we have to act local as well.
Thank you. Now I've got a question for you, which is, and thank you for your participation in the Summit for Democracy and for the work you're doing there. I think that's of real critical importance. How could the United States and the EU institutions in Brussels help you in your country in your fight against corruption?
Well, we are helping each other. And yesterday I was talking to the coordinator, Richard Nephew. He was mentioned here. So we are working together. We are helping each other. But you know, the US and the EU, and Bulgaria is a part of EU, should first show the example. It's a very important. Everyone is looking to our countries as an example, as a vitrine. If you let this happen in your house, you cannot deliver your messages as strongly as you should all over the world. That's one. And then cooperation. Again and again, the council that you have proposed in your report is a good step forward. But also we must see that the question is not only legal, but also political. And I think that the Biden administration is doing a lot by putting this question as a strategic view in its foreign policy. Viewing for Bulgaria, it makes effect.
So, you know, from your country's perspective in the Balkans and on the warm shores of the Black Sea, how is corruption tied up with the issue of Russian imperialism?
Well, you know, like any country, aggressive country, when you have a state official who is corrupted, he may be serving an organized crime organization or a foreign government. You don't know. What you know, it's not serving your public interest. And once he's not serving your public interest, he may be used as a weapon to any other interest. So this may be applied also to the topics that you mentioned.
And what's your view about how important corruption is when it comes to Ukraine and the future of Ukraine?
Well, I cannot know because I don't know exactly the subject of corruption and what the part of corruption is. What I'm certain that if Russia was a democratic state as a standard as the European states are, we would never have had this conflict.
Well, Thank you so much, Your Excellence, Krum Zarkov, Minister of Justice of the Republic of Bulgaria. And thank you to our studio audience for rising bright and early in Washington, D.C. And thank you to our virtual live audience, wherever you are and whatever time of day it may happen to be for you. I've really been encouraged by a lot of what I've heard and learnt today, and I'd like to end it on that note of optimism when even faced with the deep pockets of kleptocrats, the power of shaming and outrage and of policy choice in the United States and in the EU has considerable flex and power. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne.